So with the nerfs being about a week old, I think I can give you guys a more informed tier list now, and I'm going to just start off with the Quest Warlock is the best deck for climbing. And you might be wondering why. The reason why is because if you look here, it is the 4th highest win rate deck in the game, but of all of the tier 1 decks, it is by far the hardest to actually play. So if you learn how to play it optimally, I think that this deck could easily have the highest win rate. And I'm saying mulligans and play styles. If you're playing against something aggro, hard mulligan for soul rend, life tap less because you might not want to take that extra damage because your quest isn't the main win condition. Playing against Druid, keep Cult Neophyte to stop him from playing Overgrowth turn 4. If you're playing against slower control decks, you want to get rid of your early removal and go for cards that deal damage to you, progress your quest, or draw you cards like Backfire, Raise Dead, Unstable Shadow Blast, etc. Tour Guide, obviously. Just things like that to make the win rate go up into different matchups. Because I don't think there are any unwinnable matchups when you're playing Quest Hand Warlock. And there are 2 different ways you can play this deck, by the way. You can play it with the Flesh Giants and the Battlemaster and Anetheron and the Scavengers as a more mid-game finish, or you can play it with a different version where basically you just try to finish your quest only, and then you want to have cards that are like the Spice Bread Baker, an extra Unstable Shadow Blast. You want to have the extra Hand of Gul'dan to potentially finish off your opponent in the late game as more of an OTK. Both ways work really, really well. I personally like the Flesh Giant version more, but it's up to you. And don't forget, if you like fun educational content like this, feel free to hit the like button, comment any questions or concerns, and hit the sub button with the notification bell. Let's jump into it. So the next deck on my list is Quest Shaman because it's in a very similar boat to Warlock. I feel like it has very few, if any, bad matchups. You can play this deck as a control deck with things like Perpetual Flame, your spells, and Canal Slogger to keep you alive in the early game. You've got draw and resource generation that can help you outvalue value decks like Ramp Druid. I've beaten multiple Ramp Druids with this. And then you also can beat other combo decks or other quest decks because once you finish your quest, you can very easily burst your opponent down with Lightning Bolts, Overdraft, and Serpentine Portal. I will admit, Brucan, although he's good late game, you don't need him. You could take him out for a extra Canal Slogger, and I actually think that it's probably worth it. I like Brucan, but especially if you're on a budget, I feel like these are about similar in power level for the deck. They just fulfill different roles. So if you want to run Canal Slogger instead of Brucan because you don't want to break the bank, perfectly go for it. It's perfectly fun. But yeah, this deck is just so well-rounded. It can beat anything. It has no real terrible matchups if you mulligan correctly. It's just so good. The next deck on the list is actually the #1 deck win rate-wise according to Hearthstone Replay, and that is Beast Druid, as you can see right here. I really like Beast Druid. It's a deck that I went 10-0 with like last season. It's the deck that I used to help somebody get to Legend when I was coaching them not too long ago. It's a deck that whenever anybody asks me if it's good, I always give it like glowing reviews. I really, really like this deck. You have decent early game pressure with several decent one-drop and early game plays with Peasant, Druid of the Reef, even Nature Studies to help reduce the cost of a card. You have good 2-3 plays with the Thorngrowth Sentries and the Kennels, but the win condition really comes when you play the Oracle of Elune with reduced cost Matriarchs and Umbral Owls around turn 6. You can make an insanely powerful board turn 6, and if they don't have removal for it that turn, you can finish them off with Arbor right after that. It's a very surprise board-based deck with decent draw, decent early tempo, and if you don't want to have some of the legendaries like Gidra or Kazakis or Wildheart Guff, I would recommend putting in some extra one-drops like the Vibrant Squirrel. I would put in maybe a Claw Fury Adept, and yes, this could potentially mess you up with Living Seed, but there's still beasts that will reduce the cost of Frostsaber Matriarch a little bit more, so I think it's worth it. There are also other one-drops you could probably put in if you want. It's up to you. The next deck on this list is Face Hunter. I think Face Hunter is still exceptionally strong. If people play more slower value decks, this will definitely run them down. If you're playing in something with a quest, you can play Trog if you're going first, and that can easily win you the game as well. And also this deck can very easily snowball. Once you get a minion out and it sticks, you can play Doggy Biscuit, then Ramming Mount, and get enormous minions out on the board. You don't need to run the Trog, by the way. Instead of the Trog, you can run the Arcane Anomaly. It really depends on what your playstyle is. They both work. Trog snowballs if your opponent plays spells. The Anomaly snowballs if you're the one playing spells. It really depends on what you think you're going to go up against. But both ways are really, really good. It's got a high win rate. This is the deck I've played the most over the course of this last season and this season. And as of right now, I'm 39-13 with Face Hunter over, again, the last season and well, last season. I haven't played it recently, but is definitely good post-nerfs because its win rate has remained high, and Hunter is the highest win rate class in the game according to Hearthstone Replay. Very, very strong. Would highly recommend playing this deck. Let's jump into the next one. The next deck, in my opinion, is going to be Deathrattle Demon Hunter. This is another deck that I've played an absolute crap load, and I'm currently 32-18 with it, playing several games just the other day. I actually really, really like this deck, and with the nerfs to Rogue, it actually got better, because there are more value-based decks, you're playing against a few more Druids, and because of that, flooding the board early and just killing them off without them having a response is super duper good. And you might think 32-18, that's not as good as Face Hunter. Well, yes, but again, this takes over the course of the last season as well. And last season, Deathrattle Demon Hunter was lower tier 2. I just played it because I really liked it. But recently, the win rate has gone up a pretty decent amount ever since the nerfs went live. So I would highly recommend trying out Deathrattle Demon Hunter. Only really needs 2 legendaries. You can easily win with just one of the legendaries. I'd recommend Kurtrus because he's going to be in the game a lot longer. And all you got to do is kind of build up a board, and you can do 2 to 6 damage a turn every single turn with his hero power. It's really, really strong. A little bit further down the list is going to be Libram Paladin. I put Libram Paladin this low on the list because I just don't think it's as strong as the win rate suggests. I mean, as soon as you go to the Legend category, so like Diamond through Legend, it's pretty good. But as soon as you get to the Legend category, it drops off a cliff by about 3% almost, which just goes to show if people know what they're doing, it's a pretty easy deck to beat. It's just extremely linear. All you gotta do really is have good removal or silence and just constantly remove minions off their board so they never have anything to pump up. And if you can do that consistently, the Libram Paladin win rate falls off quite sharply. And this is something that I've used in order to beat most of the Libram Paladins I've gone up against. And because I beat them most of the time, I just feel like they're not that strong. And if you're going to take anything from this video, just know that if you prioritize removing minions and maybe even running an extra silence in some of your decks as like a tech card to beat Libram Paladin, because it is fairly popular, Libram Paladin goes from being a very strong deck to a deck that's just, you know, pretty good. Don't get me wrong, it's still the best Paladin deck in the game. I would highly recommend playing it, but it's kind of expensive. It's more expensive than basically every other deck I've said so far. It's got a lot of very clear-cut counterplay, and I'm not a huge fan of it. The next deck is going to be Aggro Shadow Priest. This deck has surprised me, and I think it is the best priest deck in the game, but I will get into one more honorable mention when I get to the honorable mentions portion, and let's just jump into it. Aggro Shadow Priest is basically like Face Hunter, but its hero power can hit anything. So you can easily fight for board by using the hero power on a minion if absolutely needed, and having that little bit of extra flexibility does make this deck, in my opinion, about as good, if not slightly better, than Face Hunter, depending on how you play the deck. I will admit that this deck does rely on a board a little bit more because it's got less direct damage from hand, so if you're playing on something that wipes your board, you're a little bit more vulnerable. So it has harder weaknesses, but at the same time, you can also do damage extremely quickly because of the Void Touch Attendant dealing extra damage every time you do damage to your opponent. So this deck can be arguably faster than Face Hunter at its best, but at its worst, it'll probably lose a little bit harder than Face Hunter. So it kind of has a wider range of how well it can do, is basically what I'm trying to say. Doesn't mean it's bad, and just because I'm putting it this low on the list is only because it's a kind of new rising deck. This has only been played for about a week, whereas the other decks have been played for a very long time, and we already know that they're very good. But I really do think that Aggro Shadow Priest is an exceptional deck. It's fairly cheap. I have a budget version on my channel already where I take out all the legendaries except the Dark Bishop Benedictus, and I ended up going, what did I end up going? I ended up going 7 and 3 with the budget version right here. So it's definitely good on a budget as well. So the next deck on this list, and we're getting kind of into the lower end that are still really, really, really good. Very easy to climb with, but this is more of the honorable mentions category, and that's going to be Freeze Elemental Shaman. Similar to Libram Paladin, I think it's just fairly easy to play against. You don't have a lot of burst from hand. You have some, but not too much. You have Frostbite, you got Gyre Worm, and the weapon. But if you're able to control the board early and focus on board removal against this deck, there's not really much they can do. The reason why I think it still deserves to be on the list, though, is because it can snowball really hard, really fast if they don't have that removal. Like, Wailing Vapor can easily become like a 3-3 by turn 2 if you have a Kindling Elemental. and the more attack it gets, the faster that they're going to close out the game. Not to mention the fact that they have some of the best 4-drops in the entire game. With all of their 4-drops are some of the highest value 4-drops in all of Hearthstone. Especially Ice Revenant, which can snowball really quickly with a ton of extra frost spells. And I will say that I think the win rate is actually better without the legendaries. I think Menacing Nimbus is actually better in the deck because it solidifies your turn 2 play. Right now you only have 2 2-mana cards. This will give you another one, which will help your elemental chain, and it also generates your resources. Whereas these 2 cards, although they are very, very strong, and I think Baron is definitely worth it in some matchups, I think Brucan is just a little bit too slow for a deck that is definitely on the more aggressive side. So if you want to take out one of these legendaries or both and put in Menacing Nimbus, I actually have a higher win rate with the budget version of the deck that runs this instead of these 2 cards, but it's up to you. So the next deck is going to be Fel Demon Hunter, and it's just a really good deck all around. I mean, you got good burst with the Kurtrus, you got some pretty good removal with Magtheridon, which is going to be able to kill off bigger minions if you're playing against Paladin or Druid. This is a tech card I threw in, it did very, very well. Kurtrus and Jace for the burst, like I just said, as well as having good healing and removal to deal with aggro decks. And because it's early in the season, there are more aggro decks in the meta right now. Beast Druid, Aggro Druid, Face Hunter, Shadow Priest, Aggro Elemental Shaman. All those decks do worse against this because of how much healing this deck has. It's a very solid deck. I think it's a little bit worse than Deathrattle Demon Hunter, but only slightly. It really depends on what your playstyle is. I really do like this deck. Even though it's this low on the list, I really think this deck is very good to climb with. Next is Big Spell Ping Mage. I think that even though the normal Ping Mage with like a more aggressive playstyle has a slightly higher win rate, I've played both of them, and this deck feels so much better. Because you're playing a slower control-based deck, it just feels like you have more responses to certain things. And honestly, there aren't that many weapons in the meta, so if you want to take out the Restaurant Viper and throw in an extra Fire Sale, definitely fine. It's up to you, personal preference, I guess. But yeah, it just feels like because you have Mass Polymorph, extra Fire Sale removal, you're just able to deal with more things. But, you know, if you want to try out the other Ping Mage version that's more aggressive and runs one more like 1-drop spells, you definitely can do that as well. They're both good. I just think Mage is in like an okay spot right now. None of their decks are like amazing, but none of their decks are really that bad either. Like even Quest and Mizaki Mage are playable.